Okay, so let's first start with what is interpreting. Now, the most important takeaway with this is that it's important to realize that interpreting is a process, and it's a very complicated process. It's not just about being bilingual, and I think that's the biggest misconception that people have about interpreting. There's an actual cognitive process that's happening where an individual, the interpreter, is hearing something in one language. They are then transferring what is said into a second language and making sure that they are keeping the meaning intact. And so there's a translation process, and then there's also a cognitive process. The best example of this is if any of you have used Google Translate or any of those online translation services, you know that, you know, when you put something in and get something out, they're oftentimes very different. It's almost, you know, like gobbledygook, and you can then perhaps re-edit it to make it make sense, but it doesn't happen automatically. And that's where you really, you know, see the importance of that cognitive process that happens. And so, you know, it's just really important to realize that interpreting is not easy to do, and the interpreters that you're working with, therefore, will need to have the best situation possible in order to do their jobs effectively. This is just to add a little bit of comic relief at the beginning of the training. I mean, this is an example of what happens when you don't have that important cognitive piece. This is something that was found in China. Okay, so now let's talk about what this task of interpreting requires. For an interpretation to be high quality and effective, the interpreter must be able to translate what is being said accurately without distorting the meaning, without any omissions, without any substitutions, and without any additions. And that's in terms of meaning. It doesn't mean about actual words, but rather the meaning cannot be lost, and all of these things need to be happening. Here are some of the common errors of untrained interpreters. You might have omission or addition of meaning, substitution, false cognates. For those of you who are Spanish speakers on the phone, some examples of false cognates are to be embarrassed and embarazada in Spanish, or sensible and sensible. So as you know, those pairs do not mean the same thing. And of course, you're not going to know what perhaps the false cognate is in the language that the interpreter is interpreting, but you might have a sense rather that if something doesn't quite line up when you're doing and when you're having a conversation or you're doing an interview using an interpreter, particularly someone who is not qualified as an interpreter, you know, if something doesn't quite line up, it might be because there was a false cognate issue. Also, untrained interpreters might lack familiarity with dialects or certain idiomatic expressions. And this obviously comes to play a lot with these populations that we're talking about with kids and with recent immigrants to the United States. For those of you who aren't familiar with interpreting, we thought we'd share just some basic information about the different modes of interpreting. So there's actually 4 different kinds of interpreting that can happen. The one that you'll be encountering most likely is consecutive interpreting. This is what you get over the phone. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that this is the longest method, because what's happening is someone is speaking in one language, then the interpreter is converting it into the second language and then relaying it to the other person. And so this basically takes a conversation and doubles the length. Simultaneous interpreters, what you see in the UN or in certain federal courts, and this picture here shows that. And that's where you have someone speaking in one language and an interpreter is basically hearing it and almost instantaneously rendering an interpretation. It's by far the most difficult thing to do. The standard practice or best practice for simultaneous interpreting is that you can't do it for longer than 20 to 30 minutes because it's very exhausting because you're basically thinking and speaking at the exact same time. Summary interpreting is where something is said and then the interpreter just renders a quick summary and might be leaving out important details. It's really up to the interpreter to decide. That can be very quick and efficient, but it's not recommended because you're really then allowing the interpreter to be deciding what's going to get communicated and what won't be communicated. And finally, sight translation is what you see sometimes in court, where an interpreter is reading something in one language and then essentially translating it out loud in a second language. Okay, so that's just the basics on interpreting, and I noticed that some more people have come on onto the training, and so if you happen to miss the first initial slides, no worries. You've got copies of the slides, and that was basic information. Also, one thing that I forgot to mention is that we are going to be reserving a significant time at the end of this training for any questions. So unless you're having kind of a technology-related problem where you can't hear us, you know, you're welcome to send us a chat during the training, but otherwise we will open it up at the end. So let's now move to the second topic, and that's language assessment. So this is what you will need to do when you are first encountering the participant or child and know that this person does not speak the same language. One important thing that, you know, if possible, and I know this isn't always the case where you can't necessarily choose what language you're going to be communicating with the person in, but is to ask what the best language is. You know, it's really important to be sensitive to any perceived bias that the child or participant might have about his or her language, and this obviously comes up, you know, with Guatemalans who speak Mam or other indigenous languages where they perhaps have been discriminated against or harmed or threatened because of the language they speak and it being something other than Spanish. So if you really, you know, are able to do this in the best way, it's always good to ask someone what the best language is that they speak. It's also helpful to get just a basic sense of how well the individual might speak English or Spanish, insofar as, you know, you ever encounter a problem or need to revert to English or Spanish to get something across very quickly. We hope that this, you know, in doing this, that you don't then just elect to continue with English or Spanish, because it is important for you know, for you to be able to communicate with the child or participant in his or her best language, so you can get all of the information and that this individual can feel like they can ask you whatever they want to throughout that conversation. Okay, so now let's move to preparing for the interpretation. As I mentioned before, we're going to offer a series of tips for you that will walk you through from the beginning to the end. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Danny Block with our UCP program to share the tips with you.
Thank you, Susan. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So it's very easy at this point, right? You meet with your client, you sit down, you dial the number, and you connect with an interpreter, and you simply start speaking. But as we've all experienced, it's actually never quite that simple. So we're going to first begin with speaking about all the different things we need to think about and prepare for before we actually begin the interpretation itself. So let's talk first about how we can prepare for a successful and meaningful telephonic interpretation. So along with the invite and the invite reminders, you will have received not just the PowerPoint presentation that we're going through right now, but also a series of 4 handouts. And periodically throughout this section and the section after, we're going to be referring to some of them. You don't have to follow along, but you do have the handouts with you for reference after the phone as well, after the webinar as well. But right now we're going to be looking at handout number 1. And really the first and most important for this section thing to keep in mind when preparing for an interpretation is to use plain language. That's the most important thing to keep in mind. But let's explore that a little bit. Remember, as vital as the interpreter is to the conversation, you as the provider, whether you're an attorney, whether you're a paralegal, a legal assistant, a social worker, you as the provider determine not only the content of the conversation, but also the flow of it. And as we'll see, the quality of the interpretation and conversation as well. So again, this idea of using plain language, what we have here is kind of a unsimplified, non-plain language example of an explanation of a legal term, in this case asylum. So I'm just going to go through it. Asylum is a form of legal relief pertaining to those who are afraid to return to their country of origin. Often this is because they or their loved ones have been persecuted in their country of origin for any of the following reasons: nationality, race, religion, political affiliation or opinion, or their membership in a particular social group. Asylum is also a form of legal relief pertaining to those who believe that they will likely be persecuted if they return to their country of origin in the future. So again, since all of us on this call are, more often than not, extremely familiar with the ins and outs of asylum, to us this might seem like a completely understandable explanation. But let's take a look. This is an after example of basically the previous slide, but a simplified, plainer language version. And this would be an example for written information, such as in a Know Your Rights presentation, for example. So asylum is a defense for someone who is afraid to go back to their country because someone has hurt them or their family for a particular reason. For example, nationality, race, religion, political opinion, or particular social group. Asylum is also a defense for people who believe that they will be hurt if they return to their country in the future. So again, this is much more simple. It's really kind of breaking down certain legal terminology to their most basic English equivalents in kind of more simple lay language. The one word here that maybe is not as plain or simple as it should be is defense, the use of describing asylum as a defense. So the expectation being that at this point in the Know Your Rights presentation, for example, you as the provider would have already explained what a defense is, right, a form of legal relief. And just another example as well of kind of reconfiguring the original example into something a little more simple. These would be some questions perhaps to use in a face-to-face conversation with a participant about asylum, trying to get information, for example, to get a better sense. So some questions could be, when you lived in your home country, did anyone ever hurt you or your family? This, as opposed to saying, were you ever persecuted against? That's kind of, not necessarily going to be a question that makes sense right away to someone, whether they're a child or an adult. Did anyone ever say they were going to hurt you or your family? If so, did the person or people who hurt you or your family say it was because you and your family were different from them? What did they say about your being different? Was it about how you look, or where you go to church, or what language you speak, or who your family thought should be in charge in government? So again, just to give you a sense of different ways we can not just simplify the questions we ask, especially when they're legal terminology, but also to really break it down into their multiple parts. And again, as Susan explained, and as we'll talk about in a little bit, this can definitely lengthen the conversation, and that's just one kind of reality that you just kind of have to expect with any interpretation. It's going to be much longer than a kind of one-on-one conversation without an interpreter. Other really important things to keep in mind: the plan to pause. Again, we can deliver large chunks of information at once, when we're talking with someone one-on-one, but even then it's good to pause. So just think how it is when you have someone else in the conversation, when it's a triangulated conversation and the person in the middle is the interpreter. So really it might feel unnatural, and it certainly will sound kind of unnatural, as many of you have already experienced potentially, but pausing is really important both for you and for the interpreter, and also for the participant to really be able to understand what's being said to them. One neat trick, actually, that many of us probably wouldn't think of in the moment is the position of the phone, right? So most of these interpretations are telephonic. So the importance of having the phone in a position that is conducive to a flow of conversation as much as possible. So in general, moving the phone to the middle, in between you as the provider and the participant. What this will do is it will help you maintain eye contact with the participant. It will hopefully help the conversation flow as normally as possible. And again, the interpreter is extremely vital, but they should almost become invisible, right, in a very successful setup. And having the phone kind of in the middle, rather than both the provider and the client gearing their thoughts and gearing their questions towards the phone, is really important to keep in mind. Another really important thing to remember is that the interpreter cannot see you. I mean, this is pretty obvious, but again, it really helps to keep it in mind again. And just to think about all that implies, right? All the facial cues, all the different kinds of body language that we kind of rely on in everyday face-to-face conversation. And even during, let's say, a legal screening or an intake with a client face-to-face, there's a lot that can help kind of augment a client's story or explanation, or your explanation of certain terms, when you can see the person face-to-face. So again, just remember that the interpreter can't see you. So you have to be really clear with your words because the interpreter is 100% reliant on your words and on your explanations. And with that, remember to speak clearly, remember to speak loudly, and remember to speak very deliberately, right? Not superhumanly slow, but definitely slower than you normally would speak. A few other things to keep in mind, as we said before, plan for a longer conversation. And because of that, a break may be necessary. As Susan said before, interpreting can be exhausting. Certain forms more than others, but in general, a break could be necessary, both for the interpreter to take a breather and also for the client, especially if the participant is sharing, potentially very difficult to share, emotionally difficult information. Another really helpful thing to keep in mind is to build in comprehension checks. So what we mean by this is, for example, instead of just asking kind of repeatedly kind of the same crutches that we rely on in everyday speech that usually are fine, but in working with participants that, they have multiple linguistic needs, kind of relying on the same, does that make sense, do you understand, kind of crutches, linguistic crutches that we always use, we really want to try to rethink that again, because again, there could be all sorts of things involved in a dynamic between an interpreter and a client, a participant, specifically a child participant, who might feel like they might not feel comfortable saying to the interpreter, and by extension to you, no, I didn't understand that, or could you go over that again? So to kind of avoid those potential feelings on the participant's behalf, one way to build in comprehension checks, for example, in a Know Your Rights presentation or an orientation, after each topic, whether it's an overview or form of relief or covering a court process, it's very good to ask one or two questions to gauge comprehension, but very specific comprehension. For example, after talking about the whole going to court process, you might want to do a little quick quiz, whether it's one or two questions about going to court, such as, who sits in the front of the courtroom, or what is the name of the person who is in charge in the courtroom, or something like that, very specific questions. In a sense, especially with a child participant, it might also be kind of a way to alleviate some of the inherent pressure in a screening, because it kind of can make it almost like a game to kind of, oh, do you remember what this person's name was, or what their role is in the courtroom. Another thing as well to remember, just in general, whether it's a KYR or an intake, is to really break down your questions and your explanations in their most fundamental parts. And we'll go on to that. We'll take another look at that in a moment. Another thing to do, for example, with intakes and screenings, it's kind of ongoing comprehension checks. This might be a little more difficult because exactly with the KYR, they're very kind of organized by certain theme or certain bit of information. So it's kind of easier to build in a comprehension check. For intake or screening, it's not as straightforward occasionally. So one good technique is to ask the participant to kind of teach back what he or she will do and when. So for example, when explaining asylum, for example, you might want to follow up your explanation with, and that piece of the conversation, with kind of just asking them, could you tell me maybe one or two reasons someone might be afraid to go back to their country, for example? And then to go with what it says here in the slide in terms of when the intake or screening is wrapping up, it's kind of helpful to review with the participant, okay, so tell me, what will be your next step? When will we meet again? Or what will be one thing that you can't forget to do, for example? If they need to change their address or if they move, and kind of all the different processes involved with that and their responsibilities with that. Okay, so once you've actually made the phone call, this is probably the part where you would think, well, we just start talking, what else is there to consider? But there's actually quite a few really important key things to consider. So you'll see on handout number 2, if you happen to have that handy, it's quite a long list of names. It kind of begins with a list of all the different countries in the world and kind of the linguistic profile breakdown of every country, what languages are spoken there. Many of you are already more than familiar with the different languages spoken in Central America, particularly the different Mayan languages. So one thing that's really important is when you're requesting a telephonic interpreter is to be clear about the country of origin. So for example, all of us are very familiar with the regional varieties of English, the regional varieties of Spanish, but the same goes for most of the other languages, if not all the other languages in the world as well, that are spoken in more than one country. So for example, if you're working with a client who says that their best language is Arabic, it's really helpful to provide their country of origin, because the difference between Moroccan Arabic and Egyptian Arabic and, let's say, Arabic spoken in the Gulf might be considerable in terms of vocabulary, in terms of accent, for example. Another good example is a client who speaks Chinese. Well, do they speak Mandarin? Do they speak Cantonese? Do they speak Fujianese? Again, most of this, if not all of it, is already common sense and common operating procedure for most of you already, if not all of you, but we really just kind of want to take the time to really kind of break it down as simply and as specific as possible in terms of what to be on the lookout for. Another helpful tip is to consider spelling out the language when you request it. You know, we've seen situations where someone has asked for a Quiche interpreter and they're given a Quechua interpreter, or they ask for a MAM, M-A-M interpreter, and they're given a Hmong, H-M-O-N-G interpreter. And again, to keep in mind that the quality of phone connections is always kind of unfortunately up in the air, so really just to kind of err on the side of caution in that respect of really being as clear and literally spelling out things as possible. Another good thing to do is to write down the interpreter's ID number once you're connected or once you're told the interpreter's ID number, and this can really be handy for a variety of reasons. For example, if the call should get disconnected, you can call back and you can specifically say, oh, we were just working with this interpreter, this was their ID number. Or for example, if you have a particularly successful or really positive connection or exchange with a certain interpreter, it's good to have their ID number handy for future calls. And on the flip side, if you have certain complaints, whether no matter what they might be, it's really good to have the ID number as well. And we'll talk about the complaint and feedback process a little bit towards the end of the presentation. So in terms of setting the stage, right? It's really helpful. You know, let's say at this point you have the interpreter on the line. You're fairly sure that, you know what, I'm sorry, I just want to go back to the previous slide. Another thing just to keep in mind, and it kind of goes to the first point, in terms of being specific about regional variety, you also want to be specific about regional variety of the same language that's spoken in the same country. So for example, we've had experiences already with clients who speak Mam, but the interpreter that they're given doesn't speak their same variety of Mam. So as much information as you can find out as possible on the child's what department they're from, what canton they're from, what region they're from in the country, specifically Guatemala, is super helpful to really have the best connection with an interpreter. I didn't want to forget to talk about that. So now about setting the stage. So you have the interpreter on the line, and this we're going to be referring over the next few slides to handout number 3, which is really kind of a script that we urge you all to follow, and it kind of follows, you know, really each conversation would be kind of different in terms of the exact order of these suggested lines, for lack of a better word, but we will be referring to that handout number 3 for the next few slides. So for example, for setting the stage, explaining the purpose of the call to the interpreter, right? You know, what is the purpose here? You know, obviously you don't want to breach confidentiality and tell the interpreter everything or even certain salient details, personal details about the client, but you kind of want to give a sense, you know, this is for a Know Your Rights presentation, a legal screening, for example, to give a sense to the interpreter as well, how long do you estimate you will need to speak with the client? And again, just keeping in mind that often the telephonic interpretations take much longer than you might think they will. It's really important as well to introduce formally the interpreter to the participant and child, rather than just going right into the conversation, which you might be tempted to do. It's really helpful to just even say something as simple as, he or she will be your interpreter today, you know, saying that to the participant or the child. Again, you want to confirm confidentiality, and you can do that by saying certain things such as the interpreter has taken an oath of confidentiality, so everything we discuss today will be kept confidential. For example, you could also say the interpreter may have to interpret sensitive material that may be difficult to communicate, but again, everything that we say here is confidential. Another good thing to kind of lay the ground rules with for setting the stage is that to kind of let the interpreter and the participant know that if for any reason either of them need to switch interpreters, whether they're not understanding or whether the interpreter feels that, you know, they just are not able to kind of continue with the conversation for whatever any reason, or should the interpreter say, oh, you know what, I have an hour, but I need to end a little bit early, I'm really sorry, just to kind of be clear with everyone that they should inform and be open if they need to switch interpreters midway through the call. Another thing, obviously, this goes back to what we were saying before in terms of confirming comprehension. We kind of came up with a mock question that, you know, we urge you to try out and let us know if it's helpful. But, you know, you're in a little bit of a scary position as a provider where you don't have a language in common with the participant or the child you're with. And you're really, in a sense, at the interpreter's mercy, and just like the child is at the interpreter's mercy as well, or the participant. So one kind of way to kind of gauge comprehension between the interpreter and the participant kind of right away is to ask them kind of this mock question: what color is the phone? And we kind of settled on this because there's always going to be a phone involved in a telephonic interpretation, and kind of the vocabulary inherent to not just understanding that question, but also being able to respond to it, kind of conveys that if there's any issue with the participant understanding the interpreter, or the interpreter translating that to the participant, it will kind of come up in that one exchange. So for example, if you as the provider say, what color is the phone, and maybe also gesture to the phone as well, the interpreter would translate that question, and then the client would say back their answer or their color. And once the interpreter gives their response, you would have really an immediate sense of, okay, we can move on, this worked out, they understood. Or if there seems to be some confusion, you can start to address that as well right then and there, rather than once you're already in a conversation and maybe have already, tried to enter into certain really important and potentially very personal details. And again, this goes along with asking the interpreter to confirm that the participant or child understands, as well as asking the interpreter if he or she understands the participant or the child. Another good trick is, and again, this kind of goes back to working with child clients potentially who might feel uncomfortable with telling the interpreter or telling you through the interpreter, I don't understand, is to kind of encourage the child to raise his or her hand if he or she does not understand. Therefore, it's a visual cue that only you will see. Okay, so we're very excited to have kind of a video, to have a video portion of this webinar. We have 3 short videos that we're going to be showing throughout the presentation, and this is going to be our first one. And this is kind of an example of ensuring comprehension, but as you'll see, each vignette kind of plays into a lot of different things that we've talked about already in the webinar or will talk about. So we're going to share our desktop with you as we've been doing. We're going to kind of click out of the PowerPoint in a moment and open the QuickTime player. If, for example, you're not able to see it, or if you're not able to hear the video, just hold on for us. Hold on. We appreciate your patience. And we do have the URL to the YouTube version of this video as well that you're free to watch after the webinar too. So just to set this up, this video will highlight the importance of a few things that we've already spoken about. That is plain language, using plain language, speaking slowly, and also comprehension checks on the part of the provider. And just a general note that goes for all of these videos. For training purposes, these videos on the webinar today portray English-Spanish interpretations, but please keep in mind that Pacific interpreters should not be used for English or Spanish interpretation needs. Okay, so I'm just going to bear with me for one second as we click out of this PowerPoint and go to the first video.
Defense for someone who is afraid to go back to their country because someone has hurt them or their family for a particular reason, such as nationality, race, religion, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. It also is defense for people who believe that they were hurt and will be hurt if they return to their home country.
El asilo es una defensa para alguien que tiene miedo de volver a su país porque ha sido lastimado por su religión. I'm sorry, that was a lot of information all at once. I'm not sure that I got it all. Can you repeat that whole part again a little slow?
Everything you told me about yourself. I just have a few other questions to ask. How about we take a little break first, such as national, race, religion, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. It also is defense for people who believe that they were hurt and will be hurt if they return to their home country.
El asilo es una defensa para alguien que tiene miedo de volver a su país porque ha sido lastimado por su religión. I'm sorry, that was a lot of information all at once. I'm not sure that I got it all. Can you repeat that whole part again a little slower? I want to make sure he understands everything you said.
Sure. Okay. Now I'm going to tell you about asylum.
Ahora te voy a hablar acerca del asilo.
Asylum is a defense for someone who is afraid to return to their country.
El asilo es una defensa para alguien que tiene miedo de volver a su país.
¿Y defensa qué significa eso?
What does defense mean?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Defense is a kind of a legal relief that gives a person permission to stay in the United States. Does that make sense?
Es una pregunta excelente. Defensa quiere decir una forma de ayuda legal que da permiso de quedarse en los Estados Unidos. ¿Entiendes?
Sí.
Yes.
Okay, good. So a person might be afraid to go back to their home country because they or their family has been hurt for a particular reason.
Muy bien. Así que puede ser que alguien tiene miedo de volver a su país porque él o ella o su familia fue lastimado por una razón particular.
Okay, so now some of these reasons could be a person's nationality, their race, their religion, their political opinion, or their membership in a particular social group.
Muy bien, algunas razones posibles son la nacionalidad, la raza, la religión, la opinión política o su afiliación con un grupo social particular.
Y sé lo que significa la religión, como si soy católico o evangélico, ¿sí?
I know what religion means, like if I'm Catholic or evangelical, right?
Yes, that's right. And do you know what the other words mean too?
Sí, exactamente. ¿Sabes lo que significan las otras palabras?
No, no lo sé.
No, I don't know.
Okay, well, and so let me first ask you some questions about your family. Is that okay?
Bueno, pero primero me gustaría hacerte unas preguntas más sobre tu familia. ¿Está bien?
No sé, es que estoy muy cansado.
I don't know. I'm very tired.
I understand that you're very tired, and you've done so well answering all of my questions, and I want to thank you for taking the time to do this and telling me everything you told me about yourself. I just have a few other questions to ask you. How about we take a little break first, maybe 5 minutes?
Entiendo que estás cansado. Quiero primero agradecerte por todo lo que me has contado hoy y por contestar a todas mis preguntas. Solo te tengo unas preguntas más, pero ¿qué tal si tomamos un pequeño descanso? Como 5 minutos.
Sí, por favor, tomemos un descanso.
Yes, please, let's take a break.
Okay, of course.
Okay, so as you can imagine, the nominations are rolling in. We understand that the video might have been a little bit choppy, but hopefully the audio was good. And again, if for some reason you weren't able to view it or to hear it very well, you do have the URL for the YouTube version right here in the slide that you're more than welcome to look at later. And definitely follow up with us if you have any specific questions. So again, this video was really to kind of look at certain aspects of ensuring comprehension, the importance of plain language, speaking slowly, and also comprehension checks on the part of the provider. As you'll see, this was kind of a lucky situation where both the interpreter and the participant spoke up and kind of said, you know, please say that again, or, oh, I didn't quite get that, or that means this, right? So it won't always be that way, but in an ideal world, it will be. Thank you. Great, so here we are back to the slideshow. So again, to continue with setting the stage in terms of explaining the interpreter's role, so we spoke about confidentiality. Again, as Susan said in her section, the importance, the necessity of interpreting everything that's said and interpreting the meaning as accurately as possible. And again, these bullet points are not just for you to be aware of, but also really for you to feel free and feel secure in going over with the interpreter, him or herself, during the conversation, just to clear the water, clear the air as much as possible. So interpreting the meaning of what's said as accurately as possible, using the same grammatical construction, the importance of not omitting, editing, or polishing anything, no side conversations except to clarify, asking speakers, this is for the interpreter or for you as the provider, asking speakers to pause, slow down, or repeat what they say, and then also asking for a break, as we saw in the video. Another thing, too, is also to encourage the interpreter to speak up if they don't understand something or if they need to clarify a point like we saw in the video. And then also asking the interpreter to let you as the provider know if and when they might need to kind of go off topic or to pause for a moment, either to take a break or to clarify something, both with you or potentially with the participant. And in terms of instructing the participant and child, number one, speaking slowly, especially, you know, if you're meeting with someone who only speaks one language and it's a language that no one else in a facility speaks, and let's say also that there's no one else who speaks that language, no other peer who speaks that language for the participant or child, this might be their first opportunity to really tell their story, and it all might come out at once or might come out kind of scrambled. So it's really important to really remind the participant or child to speak slowly, that, you know, they're there, you're there to hear them, everything they need to say, everything will be said in due time, but really to speak slowly, number one, to speak one or two thoughts at a time, to be patient, to allow the interpreter to finish speaking before they continue with their next thought. Again, the importance of letting them know that they should be very clear if they're not understanding the interpreter. And again, reminding them that this will feel different than speaking face-to-face, as we spoke about. So now I'm going to hand things over to Mike Corradini, and he's going to take us into the call itself.
Great. Thanks a lot, Danny. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Corradini. You may recognize me from video vignette number 1, where I played the role of Miguel. I'm the Senior Program Associate in my off hours here at Vera, where I work on the Legal Orientation Program. So now, like Danny said, we're going to move from setting up and beginning the interpretation to some things to look out for during the interpretation. So first, let's start with some simple things to keep in mind while you're speaking with someone through an interpreter that will help make your discussion flow smoothly. So first of all, seek to build rapport. And, you know, it's hard enough to build rapport with someone who you just met in a detained setting, and it can be even harder to do that when you're speaking to each other through a third party who's not even in the room but is on a telephone. An interpretation should facilitate rapport building. It shouldn't hinder it in any way. So keep in mind that during this conversation you're trying to build a relationship with whoever you're speaking with. Maintain eye contact. So one of the most important things you can do to build rapport is actually maintaining eye contact with the person who you're talking to. Try not to look at the phone. You're speaking to the person sitting across from you or in the same room with you, not the interpreter. The interpreter is there to passively interpret whatever you and the participant say. It's also important to be aware of how you're speaking, both what you say and how to say it. So try to speak at a moderate, natural pace, or you may even want to speak a little slower than you otherwise normally would. Remember to speak clearly, especially since phone quality isn't always great in detention facilities and acoustics don't often help. And try to use plain language instead of legal jargon, as Danny's examples illustrated. Even with a really good interpreter, a lot can get lost in translation, and it's always safer to put things into plain language if that's possible. Be patient. So even though interpreted conversations can take a long time, it's important to be patient and ask one question at a time. Try to speak in segments that aren't longer than 1 or 2 sentences. But also try not to break up thoughts or stop in the middle of sentences. So the interpreter is trying to understand the meaning of what you're saying in addition to the words you're saying, and they need context to do that. And it's just as important for the person you're talking with to do the same as you're doing, right? So remind him or her to pause to allow for interpretation and just break things down into groups of 1 or 2 sentences. If the interpreter asks you to clarify something that you've said, don't just repeat the same thing back to them. You want to pause and you want to think of a different way to say it that's going to get your point across. And try not to interrupt the interpreter. If you think of something else you need to say, wait until the interpreter is done speaking. Remember that the interpreter can't see you. So the interpreter can't interpret your facial expressions, your gestures. So try to express your thoughts using your words and your tone of voice instead of hand movements and facial gestures. If you're using any documents or drawings, describe them out loud when you're going over them with the participant, and that's particularly important when you're asking people to sign things. Remember that you're in control. So at the beginning of each section of your discussion, you might want to give a short introduction so the interpreter and the participant both know what you're saying, why you're saying what you're saying, or why you're asking the questions that you're asking. And at the end of each section, don't assume the participant understood everything. You want to make sure that if he or she has any questions, that they have an opportunity to ask you. And then finally, remember that interpreting is difficult. It's a really demanding activity. It's both mentally and physically draining for everyone involved, the participants and the interpreter alike. So if a call goes longer than, say, about 30 minutes, you might want to check with the interpreter to see if he or she wants to rest for a minute, or you might even consider calling back and requesting a fresh interpreter at some point. So it's hard to pay attention to everything that's going on during an interpretation, and it's a good idea to check in with yourself from time to time by asking yourself a few questions during the interpretation. So ask yourself, can we all hear each other very well? If everyone's having difficulty hearing, you might want to consider some other options, such as moving to another room if that's a possibility, same with using a different phone, or maybe it's as simple as changing where people are sitting within the room. How responsive to my questions are the answers? So does the participant seem to be responding in a way that makes sense? And if not, why not? Do you need to adjust your questions? Or is the participant receiving bad information from the interpreter? Or is there something else completely different happening? Is the participant responsive during check-ins? Does he or she seem to be paying attention? Is the participant asking any follow-up questions? That's a great way to gauge whether your information is getting across. And then finally, is there a capacity issue involved? So in some case, difficulty using telephonic interpretation might not have anything to do with you or with the interpreter. And you might consider probing to see if there's some issue with the participant's mental capacity or ability to be having that conversation with you. So in addition to checking in with yourself, it's a good idea to do some mental check-ins about how the interpreter is doing along the way. And you can look for a few signs that the interpreter is doing a good job. And some of those include whether the interpreter is consistently using the first person, so saying I instead of he or she, whether the interpreter asks you or the participant to slow down at all, and also whether the interpreter seeks clarification from you. If you do those mental check-ins and any issues pop up, it might be a good idea to pause for a minute and try to figure out what's going on. So you can also check for signs that the interpreter maybe isn't doing such a great job. And a couple of those signs include things like the interpreter engaging in sidebar conversations that aren't just for the purpose of clarifying the meaning of something. And we all, those of us who've used it know that those very, very brief conversations happen every once in a while just to seek clarification. But if they go on for too long or you get the sense that they're having a whole other conversation, you might want to check in with the interpreter. And same goes if the interpreter's statements are significantly shorter than what was spoken. So, of course, the same idea can be expressed very differently in different languages, but if you express a complex idea and the interpreter translates it using, say, 3 or 4 words, it's probably a sign that something's wrong, and you might want to do some comprehension checks with the participant to make sure everything's getting across okay. So now let's take a look at an example of a couple of common pitfalls that can happen when using telephonic interpretation. And to do that, we're going to use another video here in just a second. All right.
Can you ask him how many siblings he has?
Miguel, ¿cuántos hermanos tienes tú?
Sorry. 3.
3.
Okay.
So that was a pretty short example, and if you didn't catch all that, you can watch that on YouTube a little later on. But what could the provider have done better in this situation? So notice that she only spoke to the interpreter, right? She she said, ask him how many, versus speaking directly to the participant through the interpreter. And remember, the interpreter should always be addressing the participant or the client directly. And then notice the confusion that was caused by even a question as simple as, how many siblings do you have? Those of us who speak Spanish are aware of the kind of difficulties inherent in that question and in translating that to Spanish. So remember that it never hurts to be as specific as possible when you're doing a telephonic interpretation. So now let's take a look at another example. I think it's our third and final example, and this is of a challenging interview done using telephonic interpretation.
Miguel, how many sisters do you have?
Miguel, ¿cuántas hermanas tienes tú?
No tengo hermanos.
I don't have any sisters.
Okay. How many brothers do you have?
¿Cuántos hermanos tienes tú?
No tengo 3 hermanos.
I have 3 brothers.
Okay, and what are their names and how old are they?
¿Y tus hermanos cómo se llaman y cuántos años tienen?
Y yo soy el menor de todos. El Manuel tiene como 25 años. El Germán tiene como 20 años. Y el Wilson, no sé exactamente cuántos años tenía, pero yo tenía más o menos 8 años cuando murió.
So I'm the youngest of all. Manuel is about 25. Germán is around 20. And I don't know exactly how old Wilson was, but I was about 8 years old when he died.
Oh, I'm sorry that your brother died. That must have been really hard for you and your family.
Lo siento mucho, Miguel. Me imagino que eso fue muy duro para ti y tu familia cuando murió tu hermano.
Sí.
Yes.
So, can you tell me more about Wilson?
¿Me puedes contar un poco más sobre Wilson, tu hermano?
¿Qué quieres saber exactamente?
Bueno, creo que quieres saber un poco de cómo murió.
Dile que solo tenía 8 años y además no estuve ahí cuando lo mataron.
¿Lo mataron, dices? Oye, chico, es muy importante que cuentes eso a la abogada. Muy importante.
Okay, wait, excuse me. It sounds like you're having a side conversation, and I would appreciate it if you would please interpret what he is saying. Is that clear?
Yes, that's clear.
And I will explain this to my client. If you have any questions, please ask me directly, and don't worry, the interpreter will make sure that I understand everything that you say, and that you understand everything that I say, okay?
Por favor, si tienes preguntas, pregúntamelas a mí. No te preocupes, que el intérprete se va a asegurar de que yo entienda todo lo que tú me dices y que tú entiendas todo lo que yo te digo. ¿Está bien?
Sí, está bien, pero es un poco raro hablar así.
Yes, it's fine, but, you know, it's kind of strange to talk like this.
You're right, it is strange, but you're doing a great job.
Tienes razón, es raro, pero te va súper bien.
Okay, so let's continue. How old were you when your brother died?
Así que, bueno, continuamos. ¿Cuántos años tenías cuando murió tu hermano?
Tenía 8 años.
I was 8 years old.
Okay, that's really terrible. Do you know who killed your brother?
Qué terrible. ¿Sabes quién lo mató?
Mire, lo único que sé es que mi hermano ya ha llegado unos años con la pandilla cuando lo mataron. Y hace poco supe que tal vez lo mataron por quedarse con la plata que pedía de los negocios de ahí donde vivíamos. Le dije a mi primo que unos chicos de la pandilla me estaban molestando y él me contó que tuviera cuidado por lo de mi hermano.
He says no, he doesn't know.
But what else did he say? He said much more than that. Please understand that it's very important that you interpret everything that he said.
Of course. Well, he said that his brother had been involved with the gang for some time already when he was killed. And recently Miguel found out that maybe they killed him, his brother, because he kept some money for himself. He said that he told his cousin that some guys from the gang were bothering him. And then Miguel's cousin said that he should be careful because of what happened to his brother.
So when you say the gangs were bothering you, what exactly do they say?
Cuando dices que la pandilla te molestaba, ¿qué te decían exactamente?
Bueno, yo trabajaba con mi papá en su negocio, tiene una panadería. Y esos chicos siempre entraban y decían que les diéramos cosas sin pagar. Y mi papá no les hizo caso hasta que un día llegaron y nos amenazaron con pistolas.
He said they would come into the bakery where he worked and demand things for free. And one day they came in with guns.
Okay, but he did say something about his father. I heard him say mi papá a few times.
Right. So he said that it's his father's bakery and that he was working with his father when all this happened.
Okay, again, now it's very important for me to know. Earlier you had told me that your father left the family when you were 3.
Miguel, antes dijiste que tu padre se fue cuando tenías 3 años.
Así es, pero hace un año volvió y hizo que yo trabajara con él en su negocio.
That's right, but about a year ago he came back and wanted me to work with him in his store.
So we saw the interpreter do a few things here that aren't so great. And what did the provider do to address these problems? So first of all, she addressed the client directly. She broke questions down into their fundamental parts instead of lumping them all together into big paragraphs of questions. When she suspected that the interpreter was engaging in a sidebar conversation or maybe leaving things out, she confronted the interpreter directly about that. And she went over some of the ground rules with both the participant and the interpreter. So it's easy to spot some of the problems in those videos because most or all of you understand Spanish, right? But what should you be looking out for when you have absolutely no idea what the interpreter and the participant are saying to each other? So try to keep an eye out for the things that some of the things we've listed on this slide. So what if the participant appears to be frustrated or maybe confused? If the participant corrects the interpreter? If the participant opts to speak in English or Spanish, even if that isn't his or her best language, but using the interpreter is just so frustrating. Or if the interpreter frequently stops mid-sentence to reformulate or change what he or she is saying. These could all be some signs that there is a problem with the interpretation. And so what do you do if there's a problem? First of all, stop. Even if you have a lot of people to talk to, it's not a race. And it's more important to get accurate information than to get fast information. You can always remind the interpreter of his or her role in the conversation, and you can always remind the participant to speak slowly and clearly, and you can always take a minute and remind yourself to do the same while you're at it. Sometimes the participant or the interpreter or even you might need a break, and it's fine to take a break. And if the problems that you're experiencing seem to be insurmountable, you can always try to get a different interpreter by calling back, or you can reschedule the conversation. And finally, if you need to file a complaint about interpretation, hang up and call Pacific Interpreters back to report the problem using the interpreter's ID number, and then be sure to let Vera know that you've made a complaint as well. And so now I'm going to turn it back over to Susan, who's going to talk about wrapping up the call.
Great, thank you, Mike. So now let's talk about what you can do as you are ending your call with the interpreter. And I think sometimes, some of these things come up after you've already hung up, and so it might be good to even put this into the intake script or your notes to make sure that you do this before you hang up. And the first is restating any important points. If there's anything that you want to make sure that the participant is walking away with, this is the time to restate your important points. Included in this should be if and when you will speak again. I know that sometimes that answer isn't immediately known, but if you can provide some indication of when you might speak again, that is always helpful. Also, as was mentioned before, ask the participant or child to restate any follow-up actions. Ask that person to teach back to you what he or she is going to do next, and if there are any deadlines that they need to follow. It's also helpful to ask the participant or child if the interpretation was clear and easy to understand. This can impact future communication with the child or participant. If they had a bad experience and were not able to share that, the next conversation might entail them just being closed down and not wanting to participate because they know it's not going to go well. So try to use this last moment with them to see how well the interpretation worked. Also invite the participant or child to ask the interpreter any questions, obviously through you, but if they have any questions about the interpretation, this is a time to offer that. And then finally, thank the interpreter. As we mentioned before a number of times, interpreting is not an easy task to do, and it's important we want to have more interpreters out there, and we want interpreters to be available to us, and so, it's always good just to thank the interpreter. Okay, so then after the call, there are some things that you should try to do immediately. The first is take note of anything that seemed kind of out of the ordinary regarding the participant or child's demeanor. And you can write this directly on your notes. Did the person appear to be sad, upset, anxious, apathetic, confused, relieved, or tired? This will also help you when you are coming back to those notes, and if something doesn't seem to make sense, or if something seems like it might have perhaps been missing, or if somebody else is reviewing your notes, this will provide that important context that you might forget. It's also good, as Danny mentioned before, that because you've taken down the interpreter's ID number, you now have some way to keep track of good interpreters. So maintain a record of any particularly good interpreters. Sometimes that might request an advance appointment through specific interpreters, but it's good to just take note of anyone who you find to be really helpful. And then finally, contact Pacific interpreters and Vera about any complaints. I'd like you all to now take note that the fourth handout actually has a checklist that we can't take credit for. We got it from a great telephonic interpreting resource. But this checklist, or this kind of, I think acrostic list is a good way to just remind you of all of the important things that you should be doing. And it goes by, the word, it spells out telephone interpreter. So let's start first with telephone. It's important to tell the interpreter the context. Remember that he or she cannot see you. Explain the interpreter's role, both for the interpreter's sake and also for the participant or child's sake. Limit the use of gestures and facial expressions because, again, these cannot be interpreted through the phone. Always seek to ensure the participant or child's understanding. Pace your speech appropriately. And remember that consecutive interpreting is far more time-consuming than a direct conversation, and so have sufficient time available. Offer only one question at a time. And N, note the interpreter's ID number. And E, enunciate words and speak audibly. Next, we have interpreter, and so we have I, incorporate first person or direct speech. N, notice and work through additional communication problems. T, take turns speaking. Do not speak over the interpreter, even if the interpreter is making a mistake. Wait and take turns speaking. E, encourage requests for clarification from both the child participant or the interpreter. R, refrain from using figures of speech because those might not translate well. P, protect and respect the role of the interpreter. R, remain present for all communication through an interpreter. E, exercise awareness of the words that you say aloud. T, talk in short utterances, and that's for all speakers. E, eliminate vague expressions and words that may have double meanings. And R, relieve or refresh your interpreter as needed. So as we mentioned before, this is available as handout number 4. Okay, we'd now like to open it up for questions from you. And no question is too big or too small. And we would be happy to answer them. So one moment, and the way to do this is that you can submit a question through the chat function, or you can also, I believe, raise your hand through the technology. So we'll give it a moment to accept any questions that you have. Okay, we've also unmuted all of the participants as well, so you're welcome to say it over the phone as well. Okay, now everyone should be, just, keep that in mind for those of you who don't want us to hear you. can hear somebody typing. So maybe what we'll do is, let's see, we've got somebody. So that's, we have a question right now. 1 second, we're going to actually, we have a question right now from Jennifer Lamont, and we'll answer that in 1 sec. I think that we should do everything. Okay, well, there's a little bit of background noise, but, so Jennifer's question was, what's the recommended best practice when there is no interpreter available in the child's language or dialect? I mean, that is, that's a really hard thing. Jennifer, is this someone who also perhaps speaks another language that, can you just share maybe an example of a language? Okay, can you type it in though, the language? Okay, so there wasn't, so I mean, honestly, in most situations, that's, the recommendation is not to go forward because you're not going to be able to communicate properly. However, if there is just a dire situation, okay, so chooch, that was the example, C-H-U-G, chooch. I think that, if possible, you want to see if there's another language that the participant or child speaks. But, to do any sort of know your rights or intake, with someone in a language they don't understand, I mean, it's near impossible. I know that, a better alternative is to see, is to try to obtain access to an interpreter, perhaps even outside of the Pacific Interpreters Network. And that's been done, for sure, I know within the UCP program where lists have been compiled of other Central American speaking, language speaking interpreters. And, the best thing to do is to contact Vera and let us work with you to find another interpreter because, just it's just going to end up becoming, I think, a really difficult and frustrating experience for everybody. If there is a situation, sometimes Pacific interpreters might have 1 or 2 interpreters or not many interpreters, you might need to reschedule it. So that's something just to always get clarification about is there just never an interpreter who speaks that language or is the interpreter otherwise occupied? And if so, can you actually schedule it? And again, we're here to help you, and so if you have any situations or problems accessing interpreters, please don't hesitate to reach out to Vera. What other questions do you have? Anybody?
And just a reminder, at this point, if anyone who does have a question, if you want to go ahead and just write it in the chat box, we'll be able to see it right away and answer it in real time. Thank you.
We got another question, which is a good one, which asks, what do you do when a participant starts talking to you in English? And that might actually, happen in Spanish as well, right, where the participant might be resorting. And so that really, I think, is a red flag of, a couple of things. One is that they're frustrated with the interpretation. Or in the quality of the interpretation. It could be that there's a language issue where the child is not understanding the interpreter. And then, there could be the remote possibility where there are some terms that are best said in English. Globalization has happened, with respect to language, of course, around the world. And so there might be a term here or there. But if the participant is actually resorting or kind of, speaking at length with you in English, it'd be great to assess if that's because something's going wrong with the interpretation. Okay, we also had, another question here. Let's see. This is an interesting one. How do you test if there are any particular conflicts between the interpreter and the client? And this is something that I remember that I dealt with, I think, with NIJC at one point when there was a Roma child, and the interpreter, after the fact, basically warned legal service provider about the child and said that all Roma people are liars, and it was just a really awful, offensive kind of situation. And, I think that, that was probably the worst case scenario, where obviously then Vera got involved, and NIJC was also very much involved in making sure that that wouldn't happen again. But in terms of, whether there are any conflicts that are happening that might be a little bit more subtle, I think it's really paying attention to what is said and how the interpreter phrases it. One mistake that we didn't actually explicitly share in the third vignette was that the interpreter resorted to speaking in third person and kept saying, he said this, he said this. And, those kinds of things, can sometimes be an indication of the interpreter trying to distance him or herself from the client because they don't believe them. And so I think it's important to pay attention to when it seems like the interpreter is going outside of his or her responsibilities or role, and then also to check in with the child. And that's why that last kind of check-in with the child about how he or she felt about the interpretation, can be important. Okay, what other questions? Okay.
Is someone trying to? Hey, did someone have a question? I think you're unmuted now. No?
Okay. So we've got another question. That's a great question about what's the maximum size group you can give a presentation to with a telephonic interpreter. And surely that will depend on, the size of the room and acoustics, because you want everyone to be able to be heard and to hear the interpreter. And that's really what it boils down to, is that if you expect some sort of interactive situation, you want to make sure everybody can hear each other. And so you might need at that point, if you have a large group, to do some initial questions beyond what color is phone to make sure that everybody can hear and be heard. Anything else you guys want to add to that?
No, I think that sounds right. I think it depends on the size of the phone and the material, the size of the room, the material that you're going to be presenting, and how well you think you're going to be able to have a discussion. I would also just, keep in mind that if you're presenting to a large group, probably a lot more people are going to have questions, and that means it's going to end up taking longer than with a smaller group. So I would take that into consideration as well.
And just to see, it looks like Artemisa from Casa Cornelia in San Diego has a question. If you do, we've unmuted you, so you can go ahead and speak if you do have a question.
Okay, thank you. This is Artemisa. My question was,
hi, how are you?
Hi, how are you? This is, am I speaking to Danny?
Yes, this is Danny.
Hi, Danny. Do all Pacific interpreters speak English?
Sorry, could you repeat that again? Sorry, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. And if just repeat it one more time.
Do all Pacific interpreters speak English?
Do all Pacific interpreters speak English? That's a very good question.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, they're all supposed to be fully bilingual, or in all the language they're interpreting in, and that's a situation that definitely comes up with untrained interpreters, and sometimes, unfortunately, I've seen it happen with court interpreters as well, where you just know that they can't fully speak English, but they are supposed to. They're supposed to be able to fully understand and speak, both English and the other language. Is there like a follow-up question to that?
Yes, the follow-up question is, the reason I was asking is because sometimes you have an indigenous language speaker, let's say Canjoval, who will speak Canjoval and Spanish. but not English. So we may end up with a relay type interpretation session.
Yes, that's so that's and you've had that happen through Pacific Interpreters?
No,
Okay.
through volunteer community interpreters.
Okay, yeah, because I mean, we'll discuss it because it's a good distinction for everyone to know about. But, you know, when it comes to telephonic interpreters through Pacific Interpreters, you will not have a relay situation. And I'll explain what a relay interpreting is in a moment. But really, all of the Pacific Interpreters, you know, they've been trained, they're qualified, and they should be fully fluent. And so if you ever have a problem with that, definitely let us know. But relay interpreting is what you might encounter in another context when you have a language like Canjobal or another indigenous language that perhaps is less common. And there's no one who speaks both English, let's say, and Canjobal. So what you end up having is you are speaking to an interpreter in Spanish. Then interpreter number one. Interpreter number two then is translating it into Canjobal, and then it's going to the actual individual participant. And so it's basically adding another interpreter into the mix. Obviously, there's, you know, if any of you played that game Telephone, you know that can obviously make things a little bit more difficult to ensure that the meaning is conveyed, but that's what relay interpreting is. And sometimes they use that in courts when they can't access an interpreter, but you shouldn't be encountering that through Pacific Interpreters or, you know, in any of the Vera kind of authorized interpretation resources.
Great. So any other questions from anyone out there?
Okay. Oh, here we go. One more. Let's see. Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, so the question is, what other organizations does Pacific Interpreters provide services for, and how much background about what we do should we be providing to the interpreter? My understanding is that Pacific Interpreters does a lot of medical translation, so they might be more familiar with that terminology than legal terminology, and I think, you know, providing background about what you're doing, especially up front at the beginning of the conversation, is definitely something that I think you should be doing, you know, pretty much 100% of the time, unless you're just having a 2-minute long conversation with someone. I think that really helps give them context. But, you know, that also reinforces the point that was made earlier about making sure that everything you say is in simple language, because, you know, they may know very complicated medical terminology that we don't, but you could, you know, you could say something like a defense, which to us sounds very easy, but, you know, depending on what language you're using, there could be a lot of different ways to interpret that. So I think that's a great question, and I would just encourage everyone, again, when you're using telephonic interpretation with someone, really think about what exactly you're saying and how it might be perceived in different ways, depending on how it's interpreted. So thanks for that question. Any more questions out there? We can unmute you, or you can type them in. All right. Well, I guess if no one has any other questions, then we can go ahead and wrap up. So I guess I'll just say thank you, everyone, for joining us today. You can always feel free to contact us with any questions that you have. You should have all of the materials, but if you're missing anything, please always feel free to let us know. And I'd encourage you to watch those YouTube clips again. We're trying to get our number of hits up above 1 million at some point. So go ahead and do that. And otherwise, thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.